Ghana Business School. He's joined us. The IMF will be in town tomorrow, and many of you have had conversations. You've talked within in your bedrooms about, how the things we're doing could impact our program with the IMF. Yep. Let's get a view on what to expect when the IMF gets to town tomorrow. Professor Bokpin, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, good morning, Princeton, and good morning to your co-hosts, and good morning to every Ghanaian. Thank you for having me on your show.
Great, and thanks for making time to be with us. So we know that the IMF comes to town tomorrow. They review our economy, but I'm going to start off with where we find ourselves today, because there's been a lot of conversation about the impact of the recent decisions, the levies that have been scrapped could have on our program with the IMF. Let me get your take on that first before we get into other issues concerning Ghana's IMF program.
Okay, thank you very much. Of course, we knew that scrapping these taxes will have some fiscal implications. But if you look at the 2025 budget, government has taken steps to correct that, actually in a much steeper way than we thought. If you look at the fiscal outturn for 2024, with large arrears, actually the program deficit in the revised budget in 2024, we're looking at our gross financing needs around 54 billion Ghana cedis. We actually ended the year together with arrears in excess of 67 billion Ghana cedis. We were supposed to record a primary surplus of 0.5% of GDP. We ended the year with a deficit of 3.9% of GDP. But what you see in the budget, all this clearly tells you that the program was largely off track. But what the government has done, using a 9-month budget, I'm saying a 9-month budget because 3 months is gone, is to use 9 months to practically correct that deficit and return to a zone of 1.5% primary surplus. That is huge in a single year. And you can explain that through the huge expenditure cuts in excess of 10 billion Ghana cedis. If you look at the total expenditure for last year, compare that to this year, and then again, if you look at in terms of using the refund accounts, taking it down to 4% from the initial 6% and all of that. So that is what that's how government has responded to that. So within the broad framework of the IMF supported program, there isn't a major risk. Of course, there are so many other things that will be discussed, and my considered view is that returning to a 1.5% primary surplus in 9 months is very steep, and that has implication for growth enhancing spending. That has implication for the sustainability of the macroeconomic stability that we are talking about now.
What are those implications, Professor Bokpin, quickly? What are those implications? I thought you said that was a good thing to do.
Yeah, it's a good thing, but it's very steep. So what it means is that we are actually sacrificing medium to long-term survivability or our potential for short-term praise, because we need to bring the program back on track. And that is coming at a higher cost to us, together with many other headwinds that we will be discussing in the course of maybe this program. If you look at how the debt restructuring has been structured, with the bullet repayment occurring significantly beyond the IMF program period, what that means is that the program was designed in such a way that almost all the fiscal adjustments from revenue enhancement and expenditure rationalization, and then from the reliefs from the debt restructuring, from both domestic debt restructuring and external debt restructuring, were designed just to give the current program sufficient space to be able to deliver on its objectives. What that means is that the macroeconomic stability we are enjoying now, relative to, cannot be sustained beyond 2026, because the headwinds after 2026, we may not be able to navigate that. And in fact, it's the reason why I have made a case that an extension of the current program is more needful. And in fact, if you look at the data, 2024 just repeated what happened in 2016. During the 2016 election, we also had an IMF program that actually kicked in like just some 20 months before, right? And then compared that to the current one, which also kicked in practically 19 months, because the 2015 program kicked in from April 3rd, 2015, and it was supposed to have ended somewhere 2017, 2018,
2018
fiscal year, but that had to be extended. And you know the reasons they gave for extending the program? Because we missed inflation targets. We missed our fiscal targets. In fact, the fiscal indiscipline showed up strongly in 2016 against government commitment to keep to fiscal discipline.
Okay.
In fact, if you look at it line by line, from program targets, indicative targets, structural reforms and all of that, what we did in 2024 just repeated what happened in 2016. And if these mixes, deviations were good grounds for the extension of that program, then there's a more compelling reason why we should take a similar approach from 2025, because unlike the 2016 one, we had market access. So in 2017, government borrowed hugely from the international markets, okay, to supplement the local funding. But currently, we don't have market access. So the headwinds are much severe now than actually what we were confronted with in 2017, which occasioned the program extension.
Okay. So, Ellie, I mean, the caution is that instead of trying to meet the targets, which could impact us a bit negatively, let's extend it and derive more benefit from the IMF program. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, and adopt a gradual approach in terms of the fiscal adjustment, which will also create room for government to also implement some of its growth enhancing interventions. So even though government has cut expenditure, we commend them for that. And they are also restoring the program using the primary fiscal anchor, being the primary balance of 1.5%. We will say that is good news. They are also fast-tracking some of the structural reforms, which typically should be evaluated in September 2025. They've actually amended the Public Financial Management Act to the Fiscal Council and all of that. Good news. But at what cost? And how does that pay sufficient space for government to implement some of its flagship programs under the 24-hour economy? Probably a gradual approach would also allow them to implement some of their programs and engineer job-rich growth. And it's a reason also you see the GDP forecast for 2025 to be a little lower than the outcome for 2024.
So how many years extension?
I'm looking at 18 months.
18 months. So
that,
instead of ending it on, say, May 2026, you're looking at ending it end of year 2027.
Yeah, which would also be good, right, given the 2028 election. The political economy of going for IMF supported program is seriously challenged when an election is much closer, right? And you realize that in Ghana, any elected leader has practically 2 years to govern. Right after 2 years, there will be internal politics to elect MPs through primaries and flag bearer and all of that. So you see disruptions happening across government machinery and all of that.
Okay.
So if anything has to be done, this is the optimal time. And I believe that the government should engage the IMF team with a clear strategy along these lines and all of that. Of course, we've also had our own engagement with the fund. We've made our position clear to them.
Great. But before you go, just yesterday, Liberation Day in America has got many Ghanaians asking questions. So now that I have you as Professor of Finance, you probably may have to explain a few things to our listeners and those who are watching us on social media. So there's been tariffs, 10%
Yes.
on Ghana, and people have asked the question, how's this going to impact us? What's that in itself in the first place, and how does that impact us?
Well, with Trump, this is the new normal. There's no way avoiding it. So countries are trying to look at how do they cope, respond, and mitigate the harmful effect. But if you look at it over time, you cannot disagree with the US significantly. That's my considered view.
Okay.
I could be wrong, and I should be allowed to get it wrong. It's part of our profession as an academic. Over time, if you look at tariffs that US products, okay, attract outside the US markets, historically, it has been very high. In fact, as high as 80% for some countries. But if you look at it relative to goods coming to the US and the level of tariffs that are applied, US has undermined its own competitiveness with time. And you can see why Trump, and it's not just Trump, there are strong economists backing this intervention. If you look at the discussion in the US, in fact, in the development space, in the last 5 years, US is of the view largely that through immigration and many other policies, US competitiveness has been undermined. Their manufacturing, especially in the steel sector and all of that. So there's a need to rebuild. And one direct way of doing so is to restore some level of parity in terms of tariffs. It's a more direct approach. Of course, in terms of the aggressiveness with which and the lack of consultation and all of that may create some kind of uncertainty, but is the new normal. That is to be expected going forward.
So the 10% that has been slapped on Ghana, how is this going to affect us, considering the fact that we do some very decent trade with the US?
Well, you have to look within and see how you can improve efficiency. There isn't much. We don't have the bargaining power to negotiate on that. Okay, it's going to have some implications. But if you look at our export again to the US and many other countries, I think we should also be looking at diversification. And if you look at intra-regional export or trade, in fact, if Ghana will focus a bit more under the African Continental Free Trade, because that also comes with a lot of value addition, I think those are the things that we should be exploring, and perhaps through the AU, we see how we can negotiate from position of strength. But I think as much as it is, we should just embrace it, just as aid is no longer that reliable. And I can link that to the 2025 budget. If you look at our resource envelope, aid is just a little above 2 billion Ghana cedis. That's not much, right? So we have to move on. It's the new normal.
Prof, but knowing that every business owner would likely transfer costs to the consumer or the buyer, between us here and the purchasers in the US, who really would this affect? I know that, of course, US currency, they have the higher purchasing power, but really, would there be any impact at all, or Trump just doesn't care?
Well, Americans will feel it because the tariffs would essentially cause prices to rise marginally. They are also looking at other mitigation measures that they will put in place to cushion their citizens. So that is how they are looking at it. Of course, it may also affect our exports to the US and all of that and other countries. But this I say this is the new normal. So we have to incorporate that in our export strategy. We have to incorporate that in our industrialization policy. We have to incorporate that in our national economic strategy, and then also we have to incorporate that within the continental free trade area. So if you look at how other countries are responding, they are not responding from individual basis. They are looking at a group approach, right? EU and the rest of them. That is how we should be looking at it. But again, what will also happen is that a lot of countries will look beyond maybe the US market and see how they can increase their participation within the regional market or other market that would want to explore. I think those other options are available to us. That is how we should look at it.
All right, Professor Godfrey Bokpin, thank you so much for making time to join us this morning. We're very grateful that
Thank you. God bless you.
You made time to speak